So my job today is to talk with y'all about Texas in the Civil War, okay? And to think about, as you look at this map and you see all these stars of where the fighting took place during the Civil War, and you notice that very few of them are actually here in Texas. So why does the Civil War matter when you're teaching Texas history, right? And that's one of the questions that I want you all to be able to think about with me today. So how did the Civil War have a major impact on Texans and Texas history if, Texas was relatively untouched by any of the fighting that really in so many ways defines how we think about this conflict? Now, when we teach the Civil War, we all approach it in different ways. We're usually kind of teaching to our strengths, but we're also trying to make sure we get certain things covered that need to be covered. And so most of you have probably covered some of the crises of the 1850s. You've covered the election of Abraham Lincoln and the fact that, Lincoln didn't win a single county in Texas. He didn't even appear on most ballots in the South. And so you get to the spring of 1861 and South Carolina has already seceded late in the previous year in December of 1860. Mississippi was the second state out in January of 1861. And you're here in Texas and you're thinking about, what is Texas going to do? And Texas does what most other states throughout the Confederacy do. They form a secession convention. They send delegates from across the state to represent the Texas people. And that convention votes overwhelmingly. You can see the numbers here, 166-8 in favor of seceding from the Union. They argue that the Union no longer is protecting the interests of Texans in Texas. We're out. Governor Sam Houston, though, of course, is not so fast. He is not in favor of secession. He is going to be gently reminding people that it wasn't that long ago that Texas tried to go it on their own, and it didn't always go as smoothly as people hoped. And he says, look, we just joined the Union, for crying out loud. Let's just make sure everybody's in favor of this. I know you're here representing the people from your counties, but let's put it to a popular vote. Goes to a popular vote, and as you can see down here, it's not as clear of a majority in favor of secession, but it's definitely an overwhelming majority. But what I want you to notice when you look at this map are the number of these counties that are this kind of, I don't know, what is this, a reddish, rustish, brownish color. These are the counties that voted against secession. That's because they'll have an element within the population that's opposed to secession for a variety of reasons. They might be relatively kind of newcomers to the area. They might have been from the upper South or even the North where, they really are not invested in slavery. It might not be a particularly wealthy county where, again, there are very few slaveholders. And sometimes you get into these isolated rural counties where they're just like, look, I don't know what you guys want to do, but just leave me alone. We're basically subsistence farmers here. Leave us alone. One of the counties I want you to keep in mind when we're going to talk about dissent is here, Cook County. We're going to talk about the great hanging at Gainesville later on today. And so remember, Cook County is going to be one of these counties that's just like, we're not seceding. But as you can see, overwhelmingly, the Texas counties in green here did vote in favor of secession. And if you want to kind of debate this with your students, kind of one of the great questions that you can ask is, well, number one, can Texas even do this? Does the Texas state constitution, does the US Constitution allow states to actually secede and to leave? This was a hotly debated issue at the time. Since the Civil War, after the Civil War, courts, including the US Supreme Court, have absolutely said no, states cannot just up and secede. But you'll hear it, this comes up time and again in the news saying, oh, yes, we can. And so that can be kind of a fun debate to have. The other thing you can also do is look at these secession declarations. The declaration that comes out of these secession conventions, whether you're looking at Texas or even other states throughout the Confederacy, will overwhelmingly emphasize the issue of slavery. So that as you're trying to kind of help your students wrestle with the centrality of slavery and why overwhelmingly white Southerners left the Union, look at what they said in the spring of 1861 as far as why they were leaving. And that becomes very, very clear. The other thing, it's useful to look at maps like these, right, that break it down by county, because if you don't, you just have these general maps where it looks like the North is this monolithic, totally in favor of the Union. The South is this monolith that's totally in favor of secession. And yes, you get these 4 Upper South states that join the Deep South states and forming the Confederacy later. Yes, you have these Upper South slaveholding states. Why do maps do this? It gives weird colors. And teal. I like teal, but you know, these are slave states that remained in the Union, but they all look like they're unified in these decisions, right? But if you break it down by county, if you break it down by party, if you break it down by class, what you'll notice is there are pockets all over the Confederacy that are just saying, no, I'm not really in favor of secession, or we are hotly divided on this issue. You see kind of poorer counties here in this Appalachian belt, okay, in the Upper South of the Confederacy. You see those pockets that we've already described in Texas. Sometimes you're going to see wealthy slaveholders, okay? So they're members of the Democratic Party, but they're more conservative members of the Democratic Party who really are just like, wait a minute, I am invested in railroads in the North. My kids have been educated in the North. They've married Northerners. I do not want war. And so sometimes it's wealthy slaveholders who are going to be opposed to secession, but also you'll see these pockets of kind of rural isolationism, as I mentioned. If you've read The Free State of Jones, or you watched the recent movie, The Free State of Jones, this is Jones County, Mississippi, right? Where you're going to see not only opposition to secession, but later on a willingness to arm themselves, a portion of the county, and fight against Confederates during this war. All right. Now, after we have this secession convention, as people are rushing to arms, one of the things I want you to keep in mind is that absolutely you're going to see white Texans rushing into war. These men on the right here are members of the 1st Texas Infantry. About 1,000 Texans arrived in Virginia offering their services to the Confederacy before Jefferson Davis had even decided that he would accept Texas troops for the Confederate Army in the East. What they had been thinking of is Texans would really be in charge of protecting and defending Western territories and portions of the Gulf Coast. But these Texans were absolutely not going to miss out on the fight. And here they are in Richmond offering their services. And so Davis does finally admit them, and he will accept also the services of men who get formed in the East into the 4th and 5th Texas Infantry as well. But what I want you to keep in mind is just as much kind of bravado and bravery. Again, these guys are ready and they've got their uniforms, and you can see this guy's, his cover here is still a little kind of stiff and not quite kind of been curved and crushed into this kind of cocky stance. But whereas these two, okay, they've shaped these things and they're ready to go and confident and a little bit of bravado here, right? You're going to see the same thing among Northerners. Both sides are experiencing what military historians refer to as the rage militaire, right? This rush to arms, this ready willingness to go and fight for these issues that they are arguing are being threatened. Sam Houston is a great person to bring up with students as a reminder, though, that not everybody is rushing to arms. You do have cooler heads that are saying, wait a minute, do we really want to do this? And Houston is warning his fellow Texans that we do not want to do this. We will not win. We do not have the resources, the manpower. This will only destroy us, is what Houston warns. But Texans are not listening, and the war comes. So when we think about answering the question, okay, what does the war mean for Texas and Texans? I want you to think in terms of soldiers, supply, slavery, and dissent, of kind of how these issues played out for Texans and how these are kind of central to understanding the Civil War itself. When the war began in 1861, one of the things that you always want to kind of think about are, okay, what are the causes? What is each side fighting for? How will this evolve? And that's one of the things I'm trying to break down for you here on this slide. So if you try to think about what is each side trying to accomplish in 1861, overwhelmingly, right? The North is trying to preserve the Union. The South is the Confederacy is trying to preserve its right to break away from that Union and form itself into an independent nation called the Confederate States of America. Now, one of the things we're going to look at as this conversation continues today is how do those war aims evolve? Because they always do in wars, and they certainly will in this case. But if you look at it in terms of the beginning of the war, one of the things you want to think about is how are both sides going to successfully wage this war? Do they have the resources they need? And I love these charts from the American Battlefield Trust that helps you kind of think about, okay, how much manpower does each side have? How much can they rely on industry? What about railroad? How are you going to ship supplies, if you will, ship men back and forth? What about agriculture? And finance, do you have the money to do this, right? And if you look at these charts, the North can outdo in terms of finance and investment, outproduce in terms of agriculture, and outwork, if you want to think about it in those terms, in terms of industry, the South in just about every category. The two spots where you can see the Confederacy in the lead is with tobacco, which is a decent money crop in the 19th century, but you can't eat it to survive, which is going to be a problem, and rice. The South definitely produces more rice, but not all over the Confederacy. So the Confederacy is definitely fighting an uphill battle when the war begins, and this is going to become increasingly problematic. This also explains, though, why places like Texas are going to be so important in terms of supplying manpower and also supplying to the physical needs of those troops and the families themselves throughout the Confederacy. Texas in particular is going to be valued not only for the minerals that they can provide that are needed for the fight, but also for providing cattle, hogs, and grain that will be needed to sustain Confederates, particularly Confederate forces. And those supplies are going to get shipped all over where needed in the Confederacy, as long as the Confederacy can maintain control of those rail lines. In terms of what strategy will each side implement, when the war begins, you're going to see kind of a limited strategy, an effort to be like, okay, they're going to see we're serious about this, and they're going to let us go, okay? And so that's either going to be the North saying the South's going to see we're serious, and they're going to come back into the Union, or the South saying, you know, the North's going to see we're serious, and we're going to remain independent as this Confederate States of America. As the fighting continues, one of the things I want you to think about as I continue here today is, how does that change? How does this war harden, and what's causing it to harden, and how will that affect Texas and Texans? Now, like I said, think about this map and the fact that most of the fighting does not take place in Texas. But if you look in the East, you're going to see thousands of Texans fighting in the only unit where they operated in the East. It was known as the Texas Brigade. It included, at least the Texans who dominated the unit, were the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas Infantry. Over the years, it included also some Georgians, South Carolinians, and Arkansans. It was a very, very hard fighting unit, one of the most effective units that the Confederacy had in the field. As a hard fighting unit that was counted on, though, for a lot of, for its skill in a lot of hard places, it suffered tremendous casualties during the war. You also see Texans fighting in what's known as the Western Theater. When you talk about the West during the Civil War, think about the old Southwest. So places like Mississippi, Tennessee, these types of areas, what were known as the Western Theater. Texans are going to be fighting with Albert Sidney Johnston and Confederates at the Battle of Shiloh. You can see them in Granbury's Texas Brigade in the West as well. Oop, wrong way. And getting to what the Teeks really wants you to think about, though, is kind of think about what are Texans going to be doing in the trans-Mississippi West, across the Mississippi River. And there you can see Texans involved in a lot of fighting, but in particular, one of the things that you're being asked to make sure students know is about the Battle of Galveston, for Galveston, Texans' successful defense at Sabine Pass, and what's known as kind of the last battle of the Civil War at Palmetto Ranch. But again, not a lot of heavy fighting in Texas. Most Texans are going to be thought of in terms of providing soldiers and supply. Now, what about the question of slavery in the Civil War? This really comes to a head in 1862. And it's during that year that that Confederates are doing very well in the Eastern Theater. A lot of the fighting around Virginia, for example, Confederates are winning. But when they get to the West, again, thinking of the old Southwest, places like Tennessee and Mississippi, it's the Union that tends to be winning. The Federals tend to be winning in the West. And kind of the tipping point as that does, you know, the campaigns of 1862 just kind of grind on, and these forces are suffering tremendous casualties. I mean, keep in mind things like the Battle of Shiloh, where Texans fought in the spring of 1862, 2 days in April 1862. Americans suffered more casualties in those 2 days than in any conflict combined up until that point. So combine all of America's conflicts from all of, casualties from all of America's war up until 1862, April, and they lost more in 2 days in April 1862. So it's becoming this incredibly brutal, bloody conflict. And leaders are looking for ways to get decisive gains that could potentially bring this to an end. And US President Abraham Lincoln is going to look at things like not just the bloodshed at Shiloh in the spring of 1862, but the devastating bloodshed you're still seeing by the fall of 1862 at places like Antietam. Antietam this is fought in Sharpsburg, Maryland, September 17th, 1862. You'll have a combined total casualties, that's killed, wounded, and missing, in a single day, September 17th, of 23,000 men. It's on both sides total. Thankfully, the US has never surpassed this total for casualties in a single day. And you can imagine the impact it's going to have on families across the United States, you know, from Maine all the way to Texas, in terms of just what devastation the country's witnessing. And like I said, this is going to cause US President Abraham Lincoln to start to think about, man, are there some ways to just break this, and to know that when this ends, we're not going to keep having these divisions. We're not going to keep going back to fighting. And this is part of what leads him to declare the Emancipation Proclamation. He announces it on 5 days after Antietam, September 22nd, 1862, and that it will go into effect on the 1st of January, 1863. And it's important to think about in terms of, you know, what does it do, and okay, how's it going to affect Texas? In terms of what does it do, a lot of times people will say the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the Confederacy. No, the Emancipation Proclamation declared freed enslaved peoples in Confederate-held territory. So if you're an enslaved person in New Orleans, for example, which is already held by federal forces, no, you're not necessarily free. This might be coming, but it's not happening with this. It's also important to note that it does nothing to touch slavery in the Union. If you're in Kentucky, a slave state that remained in the Union, it does nothing to affect your condition of being enslaved. Now, it's the beginning. It's definitely the beginning of the end of slavery. But you know, Lincoln gets a lot of flack for announcing this rather limited decision, this law. And, you know, his opponents, abolitionists in particular, are going to say, you know, basically, congratulations, you got rid of slavery in the area where basically slaves can't be freed. So well done, big move. But again, it's this beginning of the end of slavery. And Lincoln's argument, of course, is that not only will it increase manpower for Union forces, because it allows African-American men to serve in combat roles now, not just as laborers, but in combat roles in the Union Army and Navy. But it also really creates unrest at home as enslaved people start to flee to Union lines, where now they will not be sent back into slavery. And it also, Lincoln is hoping, is going to bring about an end to this disease, as he would think of it, that has just seems to always be dividing Americans. And the hope is that by getting rid of it, this war will not either continue, or we will not go back to war again and again over this issue. When you think about how it affects Texans themselves, it certainly is going to affect enslaved peoples in Texas, who will slowly start to hear about this thing and perhaps be able to escape to Union forces. But think about what I've been telling you. There's not a whole lot of Union forces to escape to in Texas. So it's not going to have a very immediate impact in Texas at all in terms of ending slavery for any individuals. And in fact, what it actually does is increase the enslaved population in Texas. As more and more fighting drags on in places like Mississippi and Tennessee, Louisiana, you're going to start to see slave owners forcing enslaved peoples to go to Texas and taking them to Texas, where slave owners believe that they cannot be freed by Union forces in the area. So it doesn't have an immediate effect on Texas, except for a couple of things in terms of increasing the military manpower of the North and also increasing the enslaved population in Texas. But it will have a very significant impact on Texas when the war ends and slavery ends with it, including in Texas. Now, I promised you we would also talk about dissent. You always see dissent in wars. You know, there's somehow been this impression in the late 20th century that, you know, Vietnam was the first war where you saw massive protests. But, you know, I mean, we're historians. We know better than that, right? During the War of 1812, you have, you know, portions of New England threatening to secede. During the Mexican War, you know, Abraham Lincoln, as a young congressman, voted kind of against the war and was voted out of office. You know, you see dissent in World War I. You see dissent in any war. And you certainly see this in the Civil War. And so it's an important thing to talk with students about, to understand, okay, well, if I'm opposed to some of the things that are happening, what happens if I speak out? And one of the great examples you can bring to Texas history is a discussion of conscription, which is a draft that the Confederacy will pass in the spring of 1862. Their decision to modify that law so that slaveholders were able to avoid being drafted if they could show that they owned or that they were responsible for, if you were perhaps an overseer, 20 or more slaves. Because the fear was that enslaved peoples were going to have rebellions, and therefore you needed to have these people controlling the enslaved populations on the home front. Well, of course, this is going to lead to a lot of non-slaveholders in places like, for example, Cook County, that had never voted for secession, where less than 10% of the county even owned slaves. That's going to lead to an impression, well, wait a minute, why would this doesn't seem right. This seems like a rich man's war, and yet I'm going to have to be the one fighting it. And conscription is one of those issues that really contributed to not only dissent and complaints about the Confederacy, but even of pushing that further into people who were now willing to support the Union and perhaps even take up arms to fight for the Union within the Confederacy. And this is a great way, I'm going to talk about the great hanging at Gainesville when we get to some of the primary documents, but this is a great way to talk about free speech, the rights of citizens in a democracy at war, because as you know, many of us know, you can use something as recent as the Patriot Act. There are limits to your rights in times of emergency and war. And kind of how far should those limits go are some of those great discussions to have with students. And the case of the great hanging at Gainesville, you're going to see just how far it went, even when those carrying out the actions argue that they were doing it with a very democratic process, a very legal process. By the time we get to 1863 in the war, you're going to see a couple of important things involving Texans and involving Texas itself. Confederates are going to retake control of Galveston, which they had lost several months earlier in 1862, and kind of reclaim control of that important coastal city. You're going to see Texans involved in the fighting throughout the Vicksburg campaign, which lasts from the spring through the very kind of midsummer. There you see July 4th of 1863. A couple of things I want you to be aware of. This includes the Battle of Milliken's Bend, where this is going to be one of the first examples of African-American forces, which were organized into units known as U.S. colored troops, USCTs, who fought very, very well at Milliken's Bend. They were eventually defeated, but they held on to a difficult position for hour after hour after hour, disproving a lot of the racist attitudes that African-American soldiers were too ill-disciplined to be successful forces, that they were too weak or fearful to be effective soldiers. And Milliken's Bend was the first time where you'll see Confederates, not just Federals, but also Confederates noting the effectiveness of these newly recruited African-American troops. And Confederates are worried about this. The other thing to remember about the Vicksburg campaign is that when Vicksburg falls, you can see the kind of the cluster of stars here on this map, the Mississippi River is controlled By the time we're at the end of July of 1863, U.S. forces control the Mississippi River. That's going to create tremendous difficulties in getting more soldiers and in getting a lot of supplies from Texas and Louisiana. It doesn't dry up entirely, but just about. And that's going to be a real problem as you start to see more and more destruction, particularly of farmlands in the West and in the East. And that dependence on supplies from Texas and its inability to get there is going to have an impact on the Confederacy. You also have the Battle of Sabine Pass in 1863, in the fall of 1863, where Confederates in Texas are successful in thwarting a Union invasion. And again, kind of keeping Texas, for the most part, isolated from a lot of that heavy fighting during the war. By the time you get to 1865, the war has escalated through this phase that historians have often sometimes called total war, or often called kind of a hard war, where, you know, if you thought the casualties were bad in 1862, just wait till you see 1863, just wait until you see 1864. I mean, it just seemed to increase and increase and increase. Many of these graves of this photo that you see from Arlington National Cemetery are Civil War soldiers, North and South, where in a 4-year period, there's an estimated, originally they thought it was about 650,000 Americans died, but it's actually probably closer to 750,000 by the time you include civilian deaths as well related to the war. And this is just the number killed. This does not include the casualties, people who are kind of permanently disabled as a result of their military service, and how that will affect their families as well, as the primary breadwinner for the family. Is not going to be able to go back to the job that he was doing in 1861. The other thing that I want you to think about in 1865 is also how you explain the end of the war to classes. So usually, you know, we'll point to very famous paintings like this one where Lee is signed, Robert E. Lee, probably the most famous Confederate commander, is sitting here opposite Ulysses S. Grant, the most famous Federal commander. And Lee is surrendering his Army of Northern Virginia on Palm Sunday. It was April 9th of 1865. And so we speak of this as this is when the war ends. And because so much of our writing about the war was often shaped in the early years by historians living in the East, it kind of stuck. And it really forgets the fact that there are rolling surrenders as armies, as these kind of surrenders take place, moving further and further west. And if you're in Texas and Louisiana, you know, the last battle is fought in May at Palmito Ranch of 1865, and Confederate forces don't surrender until almost 2 months after Robert E. Lee signed this very famous surrender agreement. So, you know, be thinking about that too when you talk about kind of the end of the Civil War in Texas, and that it's a little different than sometimes when we talk about it on a national level. The last thing I want to mention is that as we think about how did the Civil War affect Texas and Texans, we've talked about soldiers, we've talked about supply, we've talked about dissent, and we've talked about slavery, but we talked about kind of the limited impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. But one of the most powerful impacts you can share with students is General Granger's General Orders number 3, which basically says just months, I mean, it's really weeks after Confederate forces have officially surrendered in Texas, it explains very clearly that this isn't just the end of slavery in Confederate-held territory. It's saying that slavery is done. The war is done and the slavery is done with it. And one of the things I like to do with my students is to break this down. Number one, this is not the passage of a law. We are telling Texans they are informed of the law, and that this law is building off of the Emancipation Proclamation that the President of the United States had announced in the fall of 1862 that went into effect in January of 1863. And it says very clearly, Granger is like, look, let me be very, very blunt. All slaves are free. But he's going to take it a step further. And this involves the absolute equality. So it's not just the end of slavery, but the equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. So this is a huge revolutionary change that Texans are going to be experiencing, Texans of all races. But then look at how he pulls back from that a little bit. And then he says, and the connection heretofore existing between them, between masters and slaves. becomes that of employer and hired labor. And so immediately it's setting the stage for those problems of Reconstruction, the violence of Reconstruction, the unequal economics of Reconstruction, because, well, the masters are still in that position of employer and the enslaved are still in that position of hired labor. And so you want to think about, this is one of the most powerful ways you can show people how the Civil War affected Texas and Texans. There's our question, which I hope we've kind of covered and that I've kind of explained clearly today. But before I finish, the last thing I want to make sure you're all aware of is the portal to Texas history. I'm sure you've heard about it with your work with Humanities Texas, but I just want to make sure you're thinking about ways that you could explore the Civil War. You see a great keyword search there that you can use, civ-war in quotation marks. And you're thinking about ways you could break it down, right? That you could break your search results down to county, to decades, to specific years. If you want to help students explore original sources from the time period, maybe just in your county, just for a particular year, and those types of things. So thank you all very much.
Yay! Well, thank you.